Hi, I am recording this video in late March of 2024. Why am I telling you that? Well, because about a week ago, the National Association of Realtors settled the class action lawsuit with the plaintiffs' class action attorneys on certain terms and conditions. Those terms and conditions, what are called practice changes in the settlement agreement, what lawyers call injunctive relief, will change how you do business. Whether it will create changes in the marketplace remains to be seen, but it will change how you do business. This video talks about changes for the listing broker seller's side of the transaction. If you're interested, keep watching this video. All right, so one question I'm getting is, John, will there continue to be fields in MLS that tell us whether there's a co-op commission or not, where we can advertise that our seller or us are offering to pay a co-op commission? And the decisive answer to that is no. There will not be a field identifying whether there is a co-op or the amount of the co-op. Next question, John, can we use other fields such as the remarks in the MLS to indicate that we're willing to pay a co-op and or the amount of the co-op? And the answer to that question is also a decisive no. MLSs that opt into the settlement, and I expect that virtually all MLSs will opt in the settlement, are agreeing not to permit the use of any fields for identifying either the existence or the amount of the co-ops. Well, John, we happen to think it's in our best interest for our sellers to pay co-ops. Are sellers prevented from paying co-ops? Are we, as listing brokers, prevented from paying co-ops? No, you are not prevented from paying co-ops, neither are your sellers prevented from paying co-ops. Well, you think, well, then that's a nice selling feature that might attract buyers brokers to push the listed property. That might attract buyers to buy the property because they don't have to pay their own broker. Are there other means outside of the MLS with which we can market that our seller or we as listing brokers are willing to pay co-ops? And the answer to that question is yes, you can. You say, well, how can we do that? Well, almost any way you want. Sign writers, your print advertising, et cetera, et cetera. John, what about our websites? Will we be able to identify our properties on websites and indicate that the amount of the co-op that we or our seller are willing to pay? And the answer is yes. It's regulated a little bit, but essentially the concept is so long as the website has an IDX feed showing all the MLS listings, and because it's a MLS listing, it won't identify co-ops, but it will identify all the properties that are listed in the MLS. As long as you have an IDX feed showing the other properties in the MLS, you can also have a listing of your properties, row by row of your properties, and identify the co-ops that your brokerage firm is offering. Brokerage firms can, on their websites, essentially so long as it's paired with an IDX feed, identify the existence of and the amounts of co-ops. Well, what else can we do to push our properties? I hear there's some workaround where we can identify, sellers can identify that they're willing to pay a concession to buyer. And of course, that concession could be used by the buyer to pay their broker. Well, yes, there is a provision that allows MLSs to have a field for seller concessions. But it's clear the payment of those seller concessions cannot be conditioned on the buyer using those concessions to pay their broker. So I don't really think of it as a workaround for at least two reasons. One of it is the seller's advertising that they're willing to pay co-op commissions lowers the seller's net initially, and it doesn't prevent the buyer from asking for more concessions for the seller to pay the buyer's broker. The other reason I don't think it's a workaround is because to the extent that these things are considered generic concessions, it's worse for the buyer's underwriting. Now, I'm not a technician in this, but my understanding of the jargon is that when sellers are paying buyer brokers commissions, it's thought of as in a different category. I've heard the phrasing, it's considered a concession against it's considered a concession against the sales price, not a concession against the seller's proceeds. Doesn't matter to me. I mean, in a spreadsheet, it all comes out the same. But here's the point, is that 3% concession will probably erode the capacity of the buyer's loan program to handle the concession. In other words, for example, if a concession amount was offered of this amount, this unspecified commission for commissions, then that amount may exhaust the loan program's ability to accept that concession. It might exceed the buyer's loan program to accept that concession, which then might cause the buyer not to receive the full benefit of it, or the buyer to be forced to borrow less money than the buyer would like to borrow. All right, what's the theme of all this, of all these details? And here's the theme. The theme is, remember the theme of the lawsuit is that buyer's side brokers would filter listings. This was the theory. Filter listings based on whether there were co-ops being paid and whether the co-ops were sufficient. And if the co-ops were not sufficient to make the broker happy, then the brokerage community was boycotting those listings. And so the theme is that the MLS cannot be used any longer as a means for filtering searches. What do you do to cope with this when you're on the buyer's side? I'm going to record a separate video on that and some changes on that. But the theme is you search your listings without regard to commissions, co-op commissions at all. You see if your buyer is interested. Even if your buyer is not willing to pay you 1 cent, even if your buyer is not willing to pay you 1 cent, and the seller says, no, buyer can pay their own damn broker. Does that mean the buyer moves on? No, doesn't mean that the buyer moves on, because it's all negotiable. And for example, at least in Colorado, if certain conditions are met, the buyer can submit an offer requesting the seller to pay the buyer's broker's commission. If the seller doesn't agree and the buyer doesn't want to pay, the buyer can move on and buy something else. This is no different than, for example, if a listing broker put in remarks, don't you dare submit an offer below $600,000 on this property. Does that prevent you from submitting offers below $600,000 on that property? No, it doesn't. Present properties to your buyers that fit your buyer's needs, and then work on the commissions later. That's the theme. Okay. I did not tell you everything you need to know about the settlement agreement. I cannot do that in a YouTube podcast or webcast or whatever we call them that would be engaging. If you want to know more, teaching classes on it, which are CE certified, at least for Colorado brokers. Check in with Educated Minds and sign up for a 3-hour class where we dive into more of the details. Thank you for watching this far. Catch you in the next one.